Adam Coleman invades Chicago.
There was a Trinity Radio episode.
Because you guys preach stuff that is like literally unrecognizable to an ancient African.
You know what I'm saying? It's urban apologetics. You know what I'm saying? I got showing black dignity with the gospel.
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, the real Adam Coleman. Y'all know what it is, man. Tru-ID Apologetics. And it's been a little while, man. It's been a little while. If you've been following my channel at all, you know that Rona had me, man. I got that COVID, man. Me and the whole family was down with that Rona. I don't know if it was a Marion or whatever, man. I think we had a lighter strain, so thankful for that. But it definitely was a beast. But we recovered. Thank God for that, man. So I'm back at it, recording some more stuff. Just dropped a video last week in regard to abortion. Obviously, people know what's going on with that. I'll probably be dropping one next week to kind of expand on my views on that. But yeah, man, I wanted to give you all this right here because recently I was at the Proof for the Truth conference in Chicago. Shout out to my guy, Alex McElroy, man, who had me at the Proof for the Truth conference. I was speaking on the contingency argument for God's existence, covering some of the stuff that I dealt with in the Urban Apologetics book, man. So it was my first chance to actually get to, speak on that in full. So I was really excited about that, man. So I wanted to, share that with you guys. Anytime I go somewhere, I try to get the footage and bring y'all with me. So, I was able to get the footage from that talk. Definitely want to share it with you. But before we get to that, though, I'm going to show a clip of the new documentary that just dropped, the Unspoken documentary, man, the Unspoken documentary, which you can view at unspokenmovie.com. That's unspokenmovie.com. It's a fantastic documentary featuring yours truly and a whole roster of just beasts from Eric Mason, Damon Richardson, Chris Broussard, Vince Bantu's in it, man. We got a whole slew of people, man, who basically just combed through 2,000 years of African church history, as well as Christianity amongst Africans here in the Americas, enslaved persons and after slavery, and just basically just totally shred the lie that Christianity is the white man's religion. We just totally punch that right in the face with 2 hours of history, man. It's a fantastic documentary. It's well done. Shout out to my guy, Don Carey, as well as Jude 3 and Chris Lamarck for who headed that project up. And yeah, man, again, I had the opportunity to play a role in that. I was featured in the documentary. So y'all definitely check that out at unspokenmovie.com where you can stream it right there, man. So I'll definitely be showing a clip of that and then getting to my talk from the Proof for the Truth conference on the contingency argument. So y'all know what it is, man. Like, subscribe if you feel so inclined. Hit us up at patreon.com/Adam Coleman. Your support is always appreciated. And yeah, y'all know what it is, man. Love God, love people. Take care of the things that God blesses you with. Peace.
Not just white people, not just black people. The gospel is bigger than one ethnic group.
How do I love a Jesus where everywhere I look, he looks like the Jesus of Norway, right? Versus these ideas that are informing me not only to be sharp, to be wise, to be a man, but also to be proud of my blackness.
Everybody wants to know, who am I?
Nobody wants to believe in the God of their oppressor.
A lot of the people that you want to reach, particularly black men, will have objections to Christianity based on race. And if you can't combat that, if you can't answer their legitimate questions, then you're going to have a hard time reaching them with the gospel.
So I want to start my talk today. I'm gonna do this on camera just to embarrass him. Shout out to Zion McGregor, who's waited till I just start talking to call me, but okay. I want to start my talk today mentioning this individual right here. This is a guy named Josiah Wedgwood. Josiah Wedgwood, okay? He was an abolitionist. He was actually approached by a number of abolitionists. He was a Unitarian. in the 18th century. And they approached him to make some sort of pottery or like a logo for the abolitionist movement. And this is actually the logo they made right here. It's this, the praying enslaved person that says, am I not a man and a brother, right? Now this logo was like the bat symbol or the McDonald's sign, if you will, for the abolitionist movement there in the 18th century. I mean, they would put it on buttons that they would wear, pottery, you know, things of that nature. And essentially it flowed out of Genesis 1:26. It was this notion that all men are made in the image of God and ought to be treated with a certain level of dignity. You know, alongside with that. So he crafted this this piece here to kind of demonstrate that. Now, this gentleman, the second person we're going to introduce here, kind of grizzly looking kind of a dude. This is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin. I'm sure you guys have probably heard of Charles Darwin. Anybody ever heard of Charles Darwin? Kind of know who that is? The father of modern evolution. We talked about it just last night. Now, he had this to say. Let me make sure I stand out of the way. He says that at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Now, when he was talking about savage races, he was talking about people that look like me, essentially. He believed that the civilized races, i.e., you know, those who were European, would exterminate and replace the darker races, if you will. Now, what's interesting is this. So you have two very different views about the human person. You have one who believes we're all made in the image of God and therefore ought to be respected. And then you have this gentleman who he believes that the outworking of his naturalistic theory about evolution is that you have the civilized races will exterminate the savage races. Two very different conclusions, right? Now, here's what's interesting. Josiah Wedgwood is Charles Darwin's grandfather. The same family tree, just a couple generations apart, two radically different ideas about the human person. Just want to share it to illustrate worldviews matter. Truth matters, right? If you get the big questions wrong about God, about morality, about humanity, there can be grisly consequences, right? And so when we're talking about proof for the truth, this isn't just, you know, a bunch of kind of high sounding philosophical ideas that really don't matter or don't apply to the real world. How you answer the big questions matters. And ideas have serious consequences, okay? I'm gonna do another one real quick before we really dive in. I've got a quote here for you. Obviously, I can't remember this whole thing off top, so I'm just going to read it off my notes if I may. Quote, it says, "No man ever dreamed that his interests lay in the region of fiction, or that his sober correspondence could be carried on with fairies. But the man who embraces falsehood and is governed by it, places his interests so far in a world equally visionary and corresponds not with real beings, but with creatures of fancy. As happiness can never come to us from the region of fiction or their imaginary inhabitants, so happiness never sprang, nor ever will spring, from false views of the real world and its real inhabitants. Our only connection with these objects is through the medium of truth or the knowledge of their real state. Truth is in itself a rich source of enjoyment. It never condemns, it always approves. The actual state of things which God has made in every respect is more beautiful, glorious, and desirable than any which the mind can imagine." That statement was from Dave Chappelle's grandfather, W.D. Chappelle, Bishop W.D. Chappelle, I should say, who actually Bishop W.D. Chappelle grew up on the cotton fields, man. He was an enslaved person who, upon receiving his freedom, he actually went to school, got his doctorate, went on to become a bishop, and he was a fiery preacher, man. He was no joke. He was a beast. I actually have a book of his that I scoured the internet and found online, and this is actually an excerpt from it. But he was a man who understood the value of truth. So that's, you know, now I don't know what happened to Dave. You know what I mean? He's a great comedian, but I guess maybe the family was just praying for him. I don't know. But he's hilarious. Anyway, so truth really matters. Truth really matters. We don't want to be caught up in things that aren't real. I'm saying you don't do yourself a service. So along those lines, it's incumbent upon us. Like we need to be lovers of truth. Jesus said in the first great commandment that we have to love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? Well, how can you love God with your mind if your mind is inhabited by deception, right? We ought to be lovers of truth. Like we ought to always be pursuing the truth, right? You know, that's one of the Apostle Paul's admonitions that, you know, we think on those things that are true. That's what it's all about, right? So if we're going to be lovers of God with our mind, then we ought to be oriented toward the truth, okay? So we're going to be talking about one of my favorite arguments for God's existence as we get at the truth of God's existence, okay? We're going to be talking about the contingency argument for the existence of God, okay? Why are we doing that? Because, again, truth matters, right? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Ultimately, if we're going to talk about capital T truth, we've got to address the God question. Now, as we do so, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different route than you might hear at most apologetics conferences, right? The fact of the matter is, when you look at many of the materials that are out there, apologetics materials, unfortunately, I think there's some insights, you know, from African philosophers and contributors to kind of like the dialogue of history, if you will, that often gets overlooked. So we're going to be taking a look at that, partly just as somewhat of an aside, but in the context that I generally find myself ministering in, you have a lot of people making the claim that Christianity is the so-called white man's religion, you know. So if you're making an argument for God's existence and you're only citing white dudes, then it doesn't really help your case all that much, you know. And so I want to highlight the multi-ethnic heritage that God has brought about amongst his people, you know, throughout history. And I think in doing so, then we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. A, we can make an argument for God's existence, but B, we can showcase that the kingdom of heaven is not bound by color or, you know, race or whatever you want to say. It's something that transcends all of that, and we can demonstrate that with our history. All right, we good so far? Y'all got to give me something. I'm come on, man, from that old Baptist church. If I ask you a question, I need some value, man. Y'all all right? Amen. Say yeah. Okay, all right. I'm not going to beat you up. I'll leave that to Destry. Destry will beat you up if you don't respond, you know. All right. So with that said, I want to introduce another person to you, okay? A man by the name of Zera Yacob. Very interesting guy, okay? Zera Yacob was a 17th century philosopher in Ethiopia, okay? He lived at a time where between the Ethiopians and the Portuguese, there was a lot of trade going on. So you had this interaction between Ethiopia and the Western world, or Western Europe rather. And you know, there was a lot of tension going on. There's a lot of religious tension, you know, because you had these new people with new ideas coming in, and then you also have amongst them there was, you know, Jews and Muslims and, you know, and Christians all in the same area, and there was just a lot of religious tension. And to kind of sum things up, he kind of found himself out of favor with the king for taking certain stances, you know, or having been accused of rather taking certain stances that they believed undermine the king, you know, so his life is essentially in peril. And so long story short, what he does is he has to retreat for 2 years. And so he runs away pretty much to save his life. And he spends 2 years in a cave. You know, he describes it. He says he took only a few pounds of gold and the Psalms of David with him, I'm saying, in this cave where he lived for 2 years. Okay. Now in that time, he meditated on, thought about just some really existential questions about the slave trade at the time and about the nature of evil, about, you know, human persons. And in the midst of thinking about how people are evil toward one another, he began to question the existence of God. That was a real struggle for him. And in the midst of doing so, he thought about the Psalms of David, and he essentially concluded that the existence of God is grounded not just in his feelings, but there's rational grounds to affirm that God exists. And so we're going to kind of take a look at how he got there. All right. So I should say also, after coming out of the cave, he didn't die in the cave, you know, fortunately. So after those 2 years, he came out of the cave, and later on, his teachings and philosophy, if you will, was recorded in a work called the Hatadah. There's actually, I think it's the first of its kind. There's actually a conference going on right now. I believe it's in Ethiopia, where they're having the first conference about Zera Yacob. You know, like a lot of his works seem were kind of overlooked. And, you know, they're trying to highlight that now and talk about the authenticity of it or so on and so forth. So that's actually going on right now, as a matter of fact. All right, so let's dig in. We're going to read a passage from the Hatadah where he describes his, oh, did I skip something? Oh yeah, I certainly did. Oops. I'll blame it on the clicker. Okay. So this is a long quote, so if you excuse me, I'm going to turn from you and read it if that's all right. So this is from Zer Yaakov's Hatadah. He says, later on, I thought of the words of the same David. Is the inventor of the ear unable to hear? And I said, who is it that provided me with an ear to hear? Who created me as a rational being? And how have I come into this world? Where do I come from? Had I lived before the creator of the world, I would have known the beginning of my life and of the consciousness, of myself. Who created me? Was I created by my own hands? But I did not exist before I was created. If I say that my father and my mother created me, then I must search for the creator of my parents, of the parents of my parents, until they arrive at the first who were not created as we are, but who came into the world in some other way without being generated. For if they themselves had been created, I know nothing of their origin unless I say, he who created them from nothing must be an uncreated essence who is and will be for all centuries to come. The Lord and Master of all things, without beginning or end, immutable, whose years cannot be numbered. And I said, therefore, there is a creator, else there would have been no creation. This creator who endowed us with the gifts of intelligence and reason, can he himself be without them? For he created us as intelligent beings from the abundance of his intelligence, and the same one being comprehends all, creates all, and is almighty. All right. So that's Zer Yaakov right there. Now, what's interesting is that, well, we'll get into it in a second, but he essentially makes what's called a cosmological argument, along with a few others. We'll break that down as we go, in terms of the particular time we'll look at. But you can see in his word that he uses questions to frame his argument, okay, to frame his inquiry. Interestingly enough, the word Hatadah means inquiry. So as he's making his inquiry about the question, about the existence of God, he frames that inquiry with three questions. One, where do I come from? He's talking about causes there, right? He explores that, well, my parents and my parents' parents and so on, what is the cause of me, essentially, and everything. Secondly, order. He says, who is it that provided me with an ear to hear? Now, it's not entirely clear in this passage, what I mean by that. But if you look at the Hatadah in general, we'll actually take a look at it later. There are points in the Hatadah where he associates biological functions, like, having the ability to do this, or the body being able to do that, with order in the universe, So when he's talking about who is it that provided me with an ear to hear, for Zer Yaakov, that speaks to there being order, the fact that we have function in the universe. And then thirdly, reason, or we could say rationality. Who created me as a rational being, and how have I come into this world, right? So as we'll talk about in a little bit, it's not just that we were created. I mean, that there's a universe, but there's beings in it that have the capacity to reason. We'll talk about the significance of that in a few. Now, one thing I want to say is that I mentioned a couple times a cosmological argument. So when it comes to apologetics, there's different kinds of arguments. There's different pathways, if you will, to argue for God's existence, or to demonstrate to people. By argue, I don't mean that we're just like fussing at folks, but to demonstrate to others how they can rationally conclude that God exists, right? There's different ways to do that. So you have cosmological arguments, you have teleological arguments, you have, moral arguments and things of that nature. So the cosmological argument has to do typically with identifying some fundamental feature in the universe, or some fundamental feature of reality that speaks to there being like a foundational cause or something like that in the first phase of the argument. And then there's, in the second stage of cosmological arguments, you begin to talk about what that first cause must be like. So, cosmological arguments are captured in two phases, one demonstrating some sort of first cause or first principle, and then the second one describing what that first cause must be like. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that first part initially. Identifying an argument here, or breaking down an argument to demonstrate some sort of first cause, and then we'll use Zer Yaakov's insight about order and reason to flesh out what that cause must be like in the second phase of our argument here. Okay, all right. So let's read a portion of this again. Okay, he says, was I created by my own hands, but I did not exist before I was created? If I say that my father and my mother created me, then I must search for the creator of my parents and of my parents' parents until they arrive at the first who were created not as we are, but who came into this world in some other way without being generated. Okay. Again, that's Zero Yaakov from the Atata. So when you think about what he's really saying is he's kind of going through a checklist of things that cannot really explain, where he comes from. So obviously, the first part is, he can't be the cause of himself. That's a logical contradiction, because in order to be the cause of yourself, you would have to exist in order to cause yourself to exist, and that's obviously that's logically contradictory. Now, what's interesting about this is that actually, when you look at how he's breaking this down, what you can kind of see is that he's probably been studying some earlier philosophers like possibly Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. He may have been in contact with earlier philosophers than that, like maybe Plato and Aristotle and so forth, because this cosmological argument goes back to Plato and Aristotle. And Zero Yaakov was a very learned man. And so it's probably the case that in his schooling, as an Orthodox Christian, he probably encountered some of these works, and you're seeing it reflected here. He's kind of drawing from that. Okay. So it would be, it's kind of like for a philosopher, like imagine if I stood up here and said, like West Philadelphia, born and raised on the playground, like, I got that from somewhere. It sounds familiar. So likewise, as a philosopher reading this, you're like, oh man, this sounds familiar, or something like that, Now I'm not going to Will Smith anybody in here today. I'm not going to be, we're going to leave. Oh man, we can edit that out of the video, but I'm not gonna. We ain't gonna Will Smith. We're gonna Will Smith atheism. That's what we're gonna do. That's what we're gonna do. That's what we're gonna do. All right. So he talks about how he's exploring the idea that it's logically contradictory to look to himself as being his own creator. Obviously, that's silly. But then he encounters another problem, because he goes to his parents and his parents' parents and so on and so forth, all the way back to the original material, if you will, that would have had to come about in some other way other than being like born or something like that. And so he realizes that in looking at all these possible causes, if you will, none of them, you can pretty much look to each of them and still have the same question, but where did that come from? Or where did that come from? But you always have to look to something outside of that thing, that parent or parents' parents or whatever, to explain why it exists. Now on the surface, just for my philosophy heads, this actually sounds a lot like the Kalam arguments for the Kalam cosmological argument, but we're going to be taking a look at a slightly different one called the Leibnizian contingency argument. Because again, he's asking a question like, well, essentially all of those things that he names, you have to look to something else in order to explain why they exist. And so you keep ending up with the same problem. And so he then reasons like, okay, well, there must be some other type of entity, right? Because all these entities depend upon something else for their existence, and that's not answering my question. So there must be a different kind of entity that exists, an entity that doesn't rely upon something else as the explanation for why it exists, right? That's where he gets to. Now, here's where it's going to be helpful for us to bring in some philosophical language, okay? Now you have a man by the name of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. I'm sure I mispronounced that. He's a German guy, but Leibniz, who comes along a little bit later, and independently, he's kind of wrestling with the same question. One of his most famous lines is the question he asks is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? Like, why does anything exist at all? And he's kind of wrestling with this same question. And in looking at his works, he uses certain phraseology, certain terms that help us to draw out what it is that Zero Yaakov is talking about. Okay. And those terms are those that are on the screen now. We'll kind of talk about them. But Leibniz lays out two concepts. The idea that there are contingent things, or you can say entities, contingent entities. And there are necessary entities. Somebody say contingent entities and necessary entities. There are two types of things that exist in the world, contingent and necessary, okay? Now, we're talking about contingent things, right? Essentially, those are the kind of things that Zero Yaakov was talking about, where he referred to his parents and his parents' parents, kind of on back, down that family tree to the earliest material stuff. Those are what we consider contingent things. Things that in order for them to exist, they're explained by something external to themselves. There's something else that explains why they exist, okay? They do not exist in and of themselves, okay? And if there's something that is explained, there's something whose existence is explained by something else, it could very well be that that thing could not have not existed. So, for example, if my parents hadn't gotten together, right, then I wouldn't be here. You know, if Steve Jobs never existed, then maybe I wouldn't have this Apple computer right here. You know, things of that nature, right? So we're talking about contingent things. We're talking about things that it's possible for them to have not existed. Okay. That's number one. Number two, they're explained by the existence of something else. Okay, their existence is explained by the existence of something else. We good? Okay. Secondly, we're talking about necessary things. Okay. Now, necessary things are going to be the opposite, you might imagine. Okay. A necessary thing is something that there's no way that it could not have existed. Okay. The explanation for its existence is within itself. Just in other words, by the very nature of what it is, it's the kind of thing that has to exist and could not fail to exist. Okay. So contingent things, again, are things that rely upon something external to themselves to explain why they exist. Necessary things are those kinds of things that must exist. Like there's just no way they couldn't. Okay. They don't rely upon anything outside of themselves to exist. They exist by the very nature of the kind of thing that they are. Okay. So we'll take a look at some examples. All right. I already talked about contingent things a little bit, but, you know, people, planets, books, computers, governments. You know, if you don't have, you know, the founders of this country, you don't have the U.S. government, right? You know, those are all contingent things, right? They could have not existed. Maybe that person could have not written that book, or maybe the molecules couldn't have come in together in such a way to make that planet, and so on and so forth. You know, I think we kind of get that. But some, you know, philosophers would argue that there are things that there's just, no matter how reality would have fell together, if you will, these things must exist. Numbers, for example. You know, they would say that, you know, maybe in some sense or another, numbers and mathematics exist. Moral values. You know, the fact that it's virtuous to love people and not to, you know, kick them in the forehead for no reason. You know, that's, you know, there's a moral value there that no matter how reality and the world could have fallen together, that moral value would be the case. Or certain logical truths, right? You know, like the law of identity, for example, you know, it's considered to be a logical truth. So the law of identity, just to give an example, is that everything is identical to itself, right? So if I say to you that, you know, my wife is, you know, 5'7", African-American lady, and then later that night you see me, you know, hugged up at the movies with somebody who's like 6'10" and, you know, Caucasian, you know that there's something wrong. Like the law of identity tells you, like, you know, that's not who we would describe it as being as white, you know what I'm saying? And it will probably be the last time you see me because, you know, that 5'7" woman is not having it. So, you know, there are certain laws of logic, right, that are in play. And no matter how the universe, no matter how reality could have fallen together, they're just everything is going to be identical to itself. All right, so that's some to say that might be a necessary thing. Now, there's a couple of things I left off the list. There's, you know, we'll get into here in a second, which is going to be like really the crux of our discussion. But, you know, on the contingent side, we could put the universe. You know, the universe, we can argue, is a contingent thing. Okay, so I want to take a little step further. With contingent things is not only, well, they're contingent for more than one reason. Not only it could be the case that they just didn't exist, but also they have to exist, in order for something to be necessary, it has to exist in the way that it does and could not exist in any other way. So like think about the universe, for example, okay? It could not exist at all. Like maybe it just never would have formed or something like that. You know, that maybe it wouldn't exist at all. But secondly, you know, the fact that it exists in a particular way that it does, that, you know, electrons and neutrons do what they do and are shaped the way that they are, like all those kind of things would have to be the same, you know, by necessity in order for it to be a necessary being. Okay, but, you know, it's kind of hard to imagine that everything in the universe as it is today, like, had to be that way. There's really no reason to think that, you know, the laws of nature had to be the way that they are, or that the fundamental particles of the universe had to be the way that they are. So, you know, there's good reason for us to think that the universe is contingent and belongs in that contingent category. Okay, are we good? The good news is that's probably about the deepest concept we're going to cover this morning. So if you made it through that, then, you know, everything else after here is downhill. Okay. Hopefully downhill in a good way, but we'll find out. You know. So it's kind of like a little diagram, but when you think about what Zera Yacob is arguing, he's saying that there's these contingent things, that rely upon other things. But the only way that that makes sense is if there's some sort of necessary thing that explains it all. There has to be a necessary foundation, okay? In other words, you have these things like he mentioned, like himself, his parents, and all that kind of stuff. They would be like those red boxes up there, those contingent things that could have been otherwise. They could have either not existed at all or been different than they are. But then he's saying that there must have been some other foundation, some other entity that accounts for the creation of these things, which would be like this necessary foundation, something that could not fail to exist and could not be, other than what it is. Okay. All right. Let's kind of give it a little visual there. All right. Oh, my clicker. There we go. Okay, so from this, we can actually draft an interesting argument. This is what's referred to as the Leibnizian cosmological argument, or sometimes they'll refer to it as the contingency argument. Okay, and so we'll just kind of read through the steps, and then we'll kind of work out how this cashes out here. So number one, or premise one, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external explanation. Okay. Premise two, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Premise number three, the universe exists. And so that brings us to the conclusion, therefore the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Okay. This is what you call a deductive argument. A deductive argument. And so what we're looking for is that the premises, the 1, 2, and 3, we want to demonstrate that they're more plausible, more likely to be the case than their negation, than the opposite of them. Okay. And if we can show that, and then we can show that number 4, our conclusion, flows from those premises, then we have a sound argument. Okay, so that's what we're looking to do here. So we're going to go through each of these premises and just give reasons as to why we should think that they're true. And if we show that 1, 2, and 3, there's good reason to think that they're true, then that leaves us with our conclusion, and we'll go on from there. Okay. So you might want to take a picture of that if you want with your phone or something like that, because that way it'll help you to kind of track as we're moving on. And while you're doing that, over to the right there, I have the book that she mentioned earlier. That contributed to chapter 11 of Urban Apologetics, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel, edited by Eric Mason. I contributed chapter 11 on atheism in the African-American context. And in that chapter, this is one of the main arguments that I used, along with a few others. But the whole chapter is kind of framed around this one right here. So definitely go get that book. Shameless plug. So not so shameless plug. All right, we're doing good. We're making good time. Okay. Okay, so let's go premise by premise, all right? So the first thing we want to understand is that the first premise, okay, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Remember, we talked about contingent things and necessary things, okay? Keeping that in mind. Now, this first premise is a version of what's referred to as the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, the principle of sufficient reason. That's another thing that we get from Leibniz. There's different ways you can frame it, but in our premise, first premise, we're going to frame it this way. So why should we think that everything has an explanation? Right? What would be a good reason to think that? Well, when you think about it, the idea that everything has an explanation for its existence is pretty common sense, right? Like nobody here right now is concerned that giant Darth Vader is going to appear right here in the stage and start, lightsabering everybody. Like nobody's really worried about that, or nobody's concerned that when they get home from this conference, there's going to be a rhinoceros that just appeared out of nowhere, out of thin air, and we don't expect that. If you were to go to work on Monday and you say you're 5 minutes late and your boss asks you why, and you're like, oh, well, I was driving along, and an elephant just appeared out of nowhere, out of thin air, in front of my car, and I just couldn't get past on the highway. They're probably going to have you, straitjacketed away, or maybe tested, maybe some tested for substance abuse or something like that. I mean, it's probably not going to go over too well. Why? Because we know that things don't happen or don't come into being for no reason. They have explanations. There's a very common sense way to navigate the world. So one reason to affirm our first premise is that it's just really common sense. Our deepest intuitions about the world tell us that things don't happen or don't come into being for no reason, right? Number two, when you think about it, if things could just pop into being, just inexplicably, no reason, they just kind of, come in and out of being. If that could happen, that would really undermine science, right? Our ability to discover things about the world, right? We've discovered a lot of things about the world. That's why we have these lights and, chairs sitting in, medicines and things like that. I mean, obviously with COVID-19, I mean, we kind of are interacting with science every day as we were debating about what the virus can do or what it can't do and how we prevent it and so on and so forth. Science is all around us. We know things about the world. But again, if things can pop into existence just for nothing and by nothing and just cause, then our ability to make observations about the world just goes out the window, because whatever that scientist observes in the lab, there's no way that he could say, well, maybe it just popped into existence as I was observing. There's just no way that I can make a consistent judgment about the world. And if I do an experiment, I can't say that I can pass it off to another scientist and they're going to get the same result, because maybe something will pop into existence, inexplicably, and just kind of ruin the whole thing. So it really would undermine science. Also, when you think about it, one of the ways that scientists, or really we all, make decisions and kind of navigate things is what's called the inference to the best explanation. We look at possible explanations for things and we try to figure out which one best explains a situation. So if I walk into my home, this is a very likely scenario. If I walk into my home and my 2-year-old has knocked over, a pitcher of water or something like that, and he tells me, aliens did it. Okay, I've got 2 explanations. Like either aliens did it, or he's the alien. He did it. It's like it's one of So which one of those is going to be more plausible, right? I'm probably going to go with he did it, right? But if it's really the case that things can happen and just emerge for no reason, then another possibility is that maybe the water just somehow popped out of existence off the counter and popped into existence, spilled on the floor. That's a real possibility if things can really happen and disappear for no reason, right? So if that's the case, no matter what it is that I'm assessing, an explanation for something happening for no reason would always be on the table. And if I want to be technical about it, that's always going to be a simpler explanation. Nothing is going to be a simpler explanation than something. And so you would always be tending towards things happening for no reason. And that's just not a way that you're going to arrive at conclusions reliably. You know what I'm saying? So again, from a scientific standpoint, that would totally undermine how we assess causes and things in the world as scientists are doing what they're doing. Lastly, as you're sitting here listening to me, you're thinking through what I'm saying, hopefully, hopefully I'm not boring you to death, but, you're thinking through what I'm saying and you're trying to, reason about it. You're trying to, chew on it a little bit, but if things can happen or, pop into existence out of nothing, then the parts of your brain that are, functioning right now, it could be a thought, or the brain cells involved in making a certain thought could just manifest certain thoughts in your head for no reason, right? They could just pop into existence. So rather than listening to me, you could just start, thinking about, pink rabbits or something like that, uncontrolled by you, just those thoughts are popping into your head. Well, if that's the case, then we can never rely on our rational faculties, because any given thought could either be a legitimate thought or it could be something that just popped in our brains for no reason. And so now you don't have any cause to trust your rational faculties, right? So again, for all these reasons, it's far more simpler to say, I think things just don't happen for no reason. I think that things have a reason as to why they occur. If something exists, there's probably an explanation for it. And then as we talked about, we can divide those things into different categories, whether it be necessary or contingent. But one way or the other, I'm pretty sure that things aren't just popping in for no reason. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip those last 2 points and maybe we can come back to them during Q&A. But we'll kind of get to that, all right? Okay, so premise 1, I think we're on solid ground to say that things have reasons in terms of why they exist, all right? So we're going to move on to premise 2, okay? Believe it or not, philosophers argue over everything, and some of them will debate you on whether things have reasons or not, but I think that, see, there you go. I'm trying to get this bottle of water, but struggling with this clicker on my finger here. Sorry, let me switch it up here. I'm left-handed, so it feels weird holding the mic in my right hand. Excuse me. Okay, so all right. Okay, yeah, premise 2. So we got premise 1 established. Let's move on to premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Again, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. That's premise 2 of our argument. Now, that might seem a little bit hasty, right, to the skeptic. Well, why think that it would have to be God? You know, if the universe has an explanation, maybe it could be, you know, something else. Well, let's take a look at that. I'm going to give 2 reasons here. So, first of all, in defense of our second premise, let me back up, actually. Well, actually, I'll say here. So in defense of our second premise, we can talk about what's called logically equivalent statements. Okay, there are 2 statements that might be framed a different way, but are in substance saying the same thing, such that you can't deny one without denying the other, or you can't affirm the one without affirming the other. Okay, if you can't deny one statement A, without denying statement B at the same time, because they're in substance saying the same thing, then you have 2 statements that are considered to be logically equivalent. Okay, so let's give some examples. Like 3 + 1 = 4. We don't have any challenges with math at this level, do we? Okay, all right. 3 + 1 = 4, right? Probably the easiest thing we'll cover today. If you can't get that, then, you know, see Alex in the back. We'll go over it. So that's statement number 1. Statement number 2, 1 + 3 = 4, right? Framed differently, but in substance, it's the same thing, right? You can't deny statement 1 without denying statement 2. And if you deny either one of those, again, we have a problem. But let's make it a little more complex. Let's look at example B. It is not true that no banana is yellow. Statement number 2. Some bananas are yellow. All right, stated very differently, but in substance, they're saying the same thing. You can't deny statement 1 without denying statement 2. You can't affirm statement 2 without affirming statement 1. They're logically equivalent. We good? All right, so likewise, when it comes to premise 2, okay, we're going to see it down at the bottom. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. That's statement 1. Statement 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is false, right? These are logically equivalent statements. So that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God, right? The logically equivalent statement to that would be if the universe, I messed it up. I got to mix up my own head. Let me just read it again. If atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence, okay? If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is false. It's not true, right? So that's one reason to think that premise 2 has some merit to it, because essentially it's really what the atheists say all the time. You know, they would just say, hey, look, you know, I'm thinking about a debate between, I think it was Copleston and with Bertrand Russell, I believe, you know, 2 old guys, you know what I mean? And, you know, the atheist was making that argument that, you know, the universe just doesn't exist for any reason. It's just here. You know, that's not something that's really all that controversial for atheists to say. All right, so what about a better reason? So that's one. Number 2, when we use the term universe, all right, what is the universe? Well, to be a little bit more technical, when scientists are talking about the universe, typically they're talking about time, space, matter, and energy. Time, space, matter, and energy. All time, space, matter, and energy, put it all together, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the universe, okay? Now, when you think about it, if time, space, matter, and energy, we're looking for an explanation for those things. Whatever the cause of the universe must be, it must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful, right? So, because you can't cause time and be in time, you can't have space and then be in space and then have to cause space. Like, that gets back to that logical contradiction we were talking about. So, if the universe is time, space, matter, and energy, the cause of the universe must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because in the philosophical literature, when you look at the types of entities that might be, in terms of actually those first 3 being timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, you really only have 2 options. You have abstract objects, or an unembodied mind, okay? Now, an abstract object is something like, you know, like numbers, or we talked about moral values earlier. You know, like, so I have here on the board here, you know, the number 7. You know, for example, you know, the numbers are abstract objects. Now, one of the things that's definitional to being an abstract object is that they don't stand in causal relation to anything. That they can't cause anything, right? I can't assault you with the number 7, you know, or I can't throw the number 8 at you or something like that. If I ask you the question, what does the number 8 smell like? You know what I'm saying? It's an illogical question. Like it's not that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about abstract objects. Concrete objects, on the other hand, are things that can stand in causal relation to other things. And an example of that would be an unembodied mind. An unembodied mind can, at least it's logically possible that it can create something or think something and so on and so forth. It's a concrete object. So if you have two options, in the philosophical literature, you're kind of surveying them all and you're down to two options between what could possibly be this timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause of the universe. And the first option, the abstract objects, is eliminated because it can't stand in causal relation to anything. Then by process of elimination, you're left with an unembodied mind. And in this case, we're left with a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, unimaginably powerful, unembodied mind. Now, who does that sound like? Sounds like a lot like God, right? So we're getting somewhere, but we got a little ways to go. Okay. If I pause my timer to kind of like add time to myself, oh man. I got a vehement no on that one, All right, so third premise. Can I get my sound effect? Is it possible to get the sound effect on that one, or no? Oh, it was there? Okay. Ta-da! I just wanted to throw that in there. That is my response for anybody who questions premise 3 of our argument. Premise 3 of the argument is the universe exists, right? If we're arguing about whether or not the universe exists, I mean, think about it. First of all, if the universe doesn't exist, then there wouldn't be anybody like us around to even ask questions about it, right? I mean, and we're obviously interacting in the universe. So in some sense or another, obviously the universe exists. So if you question premise number 3, then this is the response you're going to get from me. You're going to get the Fred Sanford, you know what I mean? You big dummy, So, but that being said, though, we've actually gone through premise 1, 2, and 3, right? Premise 3 is it's commonsensical, obviously. Premise 1 is very commonsensical. It's commonsensical. We gave some defenses for that. And premise 2, we talked about it as well. So now we are left with our conclusion. The explanation for the universe's existence is God. I think I am going to update this slide. I think I am going to make it the Will Smith, Chris Rock. I might not. I don't know. I might not do it. I like Muhammad. I like the Muhammad Ali pick, but I might have to, But this is what we've done to atheism here, because obviously if the universe's explanation is God, then it follows from that, by implication, God obviously must exist, because you can't be the cause of something if you don't exist. All right. So with that being said, we still got a little bit of work to do, because now we've just gotten through our, well, let me just read through this again. Contingency argument. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external explanation. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists, therefore the explanation of the universe the universe's existence is God. Man, I'm really struggling there. Okay, I got a few things I want to cover, and then we'll wrap it up here. I do want to just as a big caveat, as you study this, I hope you do study this further, but that first premise, typically you'll see, rather than at the end there's external explanation, you'll see external cause. Usually people will frame it that way. I modified it slightly because I felt like it was more, to use the term explanation it's just easier to understand rather than swapping terms. And then also in terms of how Zera Yacob and the Atada framed his argument, I felt like the word explanation might be a little bit more fitting. But I hope you go on to study this further, but when you see cause, it's essentially the same argument. And plus, also, explanations can be causes. So anyway, just want to throw that in there for my philosophy nerds who if anybody cares. Anyway, nobody cares. I just make sure. It's more so for me, probably. All right, so I want to go back to Zera Yacob's big 3, right? When he's looking at the universe and trying to find an explanation, he deals with causes. He wants to know, like, what's the cause? But he wants to go a little bit further. He wants to think about, what about the order in the universe? And he wants to think about, well, how is it that I'm this rational being, right? So we're going to incorporate his arguments about order and rationality into our phase 2. Remember, I talked about how cosmological arguments typically come in 2 phases. You have the first phase where you're establishing some fundamental cause. We just did that with the contingency argument. And then the second phase, we're talking about what that cause must be like, okay? So we're going to dig into that a little bit. Okay. Now, this is actually pulled from another section of the title. I'm going to read this right quick, and we'll kind of see where Zariakov is going. I'll be real brief with this one. He says, I was admiring the beauty of God's creatures according to their orders. The domestic animals and the wild beasts, they are drawn by the nature of their creation towards the preservation of their life and the propagation of their species. Moreover, trees in the fields and plants which are created with great wisdom grow, bloom, flourish, produce the fruit of their respective seed according to their orders and without error. All things are great and admirable, and all things are created with great wisdom. Okay, so this is where he's kind of reflecting on nature a bit. He's talking about, you know, living species and plants and so on and so forth. He's identifying order in the universe. Now, when you think about the drive that the living things have to survive and to propagate their species and to reproduce and so on and so forth, obviously today we can look at DNA as kind of being the underpinning of why living things do what they do. Now, I'll be really brief with this, but interestingly enough, if you look at any textbook or talk to any biologist, they'll tell you that when you're dealing with DNA, you're talking about essentially a language. It's like a biological language. Your DNA forms with just 4 letters. I know we were joking about that last night. The 4 letters of DNA, but anyway. It's essentially an alphabet that's extremely complex. It's extremely complex. I'm going to steal from Alex's example yesterday. If you're walking along the beach and you see a bunch of sticks just kind of thrown together haphazardly or whatever, you really wouldn't think anything of it. You just keep it moving. But if you're walking, along and you see sticks arranged to say, "Don't get in the water. There are sharks." You're not going to think like, man, it's just amazing how the waves just kind of washed up and just spelled that out. That's phenomenal. You're going to be like, Dad, you know what? I'm not going to get in the water. There's sharks. Somebody is trying to tell me something about what's in the water. Why? Because we infer, rationally so, we infer that when we see a message, then there must be a messenger. Okay. Well, the most prevalent message in all of creation right now was probably mathematics, but as far as biological stuff would be the message of DNA and how it's underpinning and essentially the instruction manual for all life, right? So when you see that message encoded in DNA, it's rational, again, to infer that there must be a messenger because messages come from minds. I'm saying, so there must be a great mind behind it. And essentially this is what Zariakov is talking about. Now, aside from that, there's all sorts of teleological arguments. I mentioned that before, but just kind of basically, the fine-tuning argument right there. I just talked about genetic information. We could talk about mathematics, the fact that this whole universe is arranged on a mathematical structure. Everything that happens in the physical world you can describe with mathematics. Everything that happens in the physical world in some way aligns with this mathematical structure. Well, how could that be? If you have these, like we talked about, numbers and mathematical functions, those are abstracts. They can't cause anything. So math can't cause us to be, or cause the physical world to do anything. So how is it that it just the physical world just sits on top of this mathematical structure like that? Well, it makes a whole lot of sense if you have a divine mathematician who's able to sit back and do all that. That makes a whole lot of sense. That's a solid explanation, if you will. Okay. So, that deals with the order piece. But what about rationality? What about rationality? Again, I want to kind of revisit something that Zariakov said earlier, and then we'll add in another piece. He says, this creator who endowed us with the gifts of intelligence and reason can he himself be without them? For he created us as intelligent beings from the abundance of his intelligence, and the same one being comprehends all. Another quote from a different section of the Atala, he says, God did not create me intelligent without a purpose. That is to look for him, to grasp him and his wisdom in the path he's opened for me, and to worship him as long as I live. Okay. Now, I tell you, the reason, the ability to reason, to have these rational capacities, I don't know. I think we just kind of take it for granted. It's extremely profound. Like, there's no good reason if God doesn't exist, right? It's just the physical world. Okay, let's just say that, for sake of argument, the only thing that exists is the physical world, right? The best explanation in terms of why we are, the fact that we exist as we do today, would be something like the process of evolution, or going all the way back to the Big Bang, or whatever you want to call the first piece of the universe, but first event in the universe. But nevertheless, we'd have to look to our history to figure out, okay, well, how do we have these rational capacities? Now, let's think about two things real quick. Let's give you the snippet version. Okay, let's say that, again, let's say God doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the physical world, okay? All the way back to the Big Bang, that's where you have your first event in the physical world, okay? This present universe, if you will, okay? Now, if that's the case, then everything that happens in the physical world would be like another domino falling in a set of dominoes going all the way back to the Big Bang. The Big Bang sparks it off, and everything is just falling dominoes after that. Okay, that happens in the physical world. Now, if we don't have a soul and we're just physical, then among those falling dominoes would be the physical events going on in our brains that produce our thoughts. Right? So if everything happening in the physical world is another falling domino, and our brains are physical, then everything happening in our brains is just another falling domino. Okay? So that would mean that your thoughts are not being produced by actual mental activity as we understand it. It would just be like mechanically or robotically produced by the physical goings on in the brain, going all the way back to the Big Bang, if you will. If that's the case, then there's no good reason to expect, okay, thank you. If that's the case, then there's no good reason to expect that we're able to reason, because as I'm talking, as you're thinking about what I'm saying, you're not really thinking. It's just physical events in the brain, going on, over which you have no control. If that's the case, then again, then real reasoning isn't happening. Okay? That doesn't account for what Zariak was talking about. Secondly, if evolution is the cause of why we're here, just left to, like we talked about yesterday, natural selection. Well, I mean, to be honest with you, evolution is all about survival. It's all about, developing and adapting in a way that helps you survive. And there's no good reason to think that we would necessarily have had to develop in such a way that we have a mental capacity beyond just basic survival needs. You maybe could say, okay, well, we developed enough to survive, but to be able to do calculus and advanced mathematics and all this kind of stuff, and to have conversations like these, or to be able to harness aesthetics and create art and music and so on and so forth, there's just no good reason to think on evolution alone that we'd be able to do that. All right, I refer you to Alvin Plantinga, his evolutionary argument against naturalism. So on two counts, both in terms of evolution and the physical events of the world, if naturalism is true, if all we have is a physical world existing and God doesn't exist, then we've got some really good reason to think that, we probably shouldn't have the ability to reason as we do. But what does make a lot of sense, is if you have a ultimate mind, that unembodied mind at the beginning of it all. I'm saying you're not trying to smuggle in intelligence and rationality at the end, but you're accounting for it from the very creation. In the beginning, God, right? On a theistic worldview, from a Christian perspective, we're not trying to smuggle rationality in. It's at the very foundation of why anything exists at all. Okay, and so we've got an explanation that's not just plucked out of thin air trying to make it work. Rationality has been here from the beginning. Okay. Atheist Thomas Nagel says the existence of consciousness seems to imply that the physical description of the universe, in spite of its richness and explanatory power, is only part of the truth. That was an atheist who said that, about consciousness. So I'm not just making it up. The fact that we have consciousness speaks to there being something beyond just natural happenings in the world. Okay. So with that being said, that gives us something like, in addition to having this immaterial, timeless, spaceless, extremely powerful entity, that created the world, there's good reason to think that just like with Yaakov, that entity has rationality, and that he used that rationality to order the world in a particular way, and that being is God. That's who Christians refer to as God. Now, I've got 5 minutes left, I believe. According to my timer, I'll try to make this too. I'm going to do something that's extremely different. I've never done this before, and I'm just going to do it because I believe that I should. I recognize that information is not enough. I recognize that, like we talked about last night, in addition to God wanting to sow seeds of truth in us, from an information standpoint, we just went through an argument to demonstrate the existence of God. We talked about order and reason and so forth. So we've got rational grounds to affirm that God exists. But I do believe that there's an enemy of our souls that intends to utilize deception to keep us blinded so that we can't walk rightly with God, And so when it comes to apologetics, it's not purely propositional. The Bible talks about how we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in heavenly places, in spiritual places, right? To the pulling down of strongholds. And when you look at that word strongholds, believe it or not, it's not just some random place off in the spiritual ether. It's referring to mind frames and mindsets and outposts of deception that can occupy our minds in such a way that we are not able to attend to God rightly and love him with our minds, like I talked about at the beginning. So what I want to do is, I want to have an altar call, if that's okay. You know, I want to take a moment to pray for people. And if you find yourself, if you're in this place today and you feel like you've struggled with doubt and there's some sort of oppressive doubt that you just can't shake it, I would suggest to you there's probably something more than just information going on. And I want to pray for you about that. You know, I want to pray for people to be set free from the chains of deception. So I know we're going to have to do this rather quickly, but if that's you, would you mind coming to the front so I can pray for you? Would that be all right? Anybody? I know this is kind of a scary thing. It's like, man, like an altar call at an apologetics conference, like where do they do that at? You know, but we are in the church. You know what I'm saying? Okay, well, I'll tell you what. Let's not put people on the spot. Oh, you? Okay, cool, brother. Praise God, praise God.